Hey Herd Watchers, this is my third time at this video. This is the last one. If I run along, if I ramble, you're just gonna have to live with it. It's November 5th. It's right around 9:35 in the morning, and I want to talk about the election. Now, I'm not going to talk about, I'm not going to go over who to vote for or whatever. Look, you've already voted. Obviously, Trump being behind and needing to win the states he needs to win is not where I want to be in the election, but it is what it is. What I want to talk about is the conversation we're having nationally now about the election as a whole and the process and how important that is. So for my friends and my viewers who are not familiar with the way the American voter system works, in most states, the states set their own rules. In most states, you have to register to vote, which means you kind of go in a little database. And then when you go to vote, you sign a paper and they kind of match that to the voter registration database. And depending on which state, that happens with various levels of certainty. What's not super common in America is that you have to prove who you are or that the voter registration database is maintained particularly well. For historical reasons and the fact that Americans are fundamentally paranoid, that database is not tied to any other governmental database you can think of. So what that means is, let's say I'm in New Jersey, which I am, and I'm thinking about moving, and I am. Let's say I move to Texas. I can go to Texas and register to vote in Texas, and I don't actually have to notify the New Jersey voter registration system that I have moved. And in fact, most people don't. That record will essentially never fall off the New Jersey voter registration on its own. Someone would have to challenge it. That means for essentially ever, I will be registered to vote in Texas and registered to vote in New Jersey. And if I was willing to vote for the presidency in Texas, get on an airplane, come to New Jersey, vote to register, vote in New Jersey, that duplication would never be caught. Those databases will never be compared. More so, when I move away, whoever moves into this house could, in theory, request an absentee ballot in my name. They would send that ballot to this address. He could fill it out. And with very, very little work, he could go and vote on my behalf. He would have to kind of match my signature, but honestly, nobody checks it that hard, right? And in a lot of states, you don't even need that. In Pennsylvania, they just had a legal challenge in the last election that you can't actually challenge a ballot just because the signatures don't match. So even that minimal level of verification is gone. So what that means from a data point of view is that the voter registration rolls are probably somewhere between 40 and 45% just horribly broken. They're out of date or corrupt or have people who are dead on them or have people with the wrong address, or the signatures are probably out of date if you need a signature at all. Now, for a long time, everybody's known that. It's an open secret that the voter registration database is horrible. But the Democrats, and it is essentially the Democrats, have successfully prevented any meaningful conversation around the topic of voter fraud by saying there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And if you're talking about voter fraud, what you're really trying to do is keep black people from voting. Now, there are some historical reasons for that concern. Interestingly, mostly Democrat abuses of power, but okay, let's let that go. But what that means is that you're not really allowed to talk about voter fraud in any meaningful way. If you talk about it meaningfully and have, really force the conversation, you're obviously a vote suppressive racist. Or somebody just tells you it's been proven that it's not really a problem. Well, it hasn't been proven at all. What they'll say is nobody's ever successfully proven that there was widespread voter fraud. But of course, nobody's proven that. How could you prove it? The databases are broken. The jurisdictions are broken. It's a hard thing to do on a national level. And most Republicans don't have the spine to really have that conversation. So it tends to go something like this. Some Republican will be like, hey, I'm really, really worried about voter fraud. And then the CNN person he's talking to is like, obviously, you're a filthy racist who doesn't want black people to vote. And the Republican goes, oh, my God, I'm not a filthy racist. Please love me. I'll stop talking about it. Donald Trump is not that guy, right? Donald Trump is perfectly willing to have conversations regardless of what names you call him. So Donald Trump is uniquely willing among Republicans to fight voter fraud if he thinks it happened. But then something beautiful happened. The Democrats, using COVID as an excuse, decided that they were going to send an absentee ballot to everyone in America they could manage to send them to based on the voter registration rolls. And they did that because, again, in a pre-Trump world, this was perfect. You send all these registrations out. It's obviously ripe for fraud. It's obviously chaotic. It's obviously a nightmare, but they want chaos in this election because then they can delegitimize the outcome if it doesn't go their way. And typically, that this was going to lead to widespread voter fraud is not a problem because the Republicans are not allowed, essentially socially not allowed to talk about voter fraud, as we saw. Twitter and Facebook and these places going so far as to suppress any topic that tried to a lot of conversations around voter fraud. They would just shut them down and then say, we fact check this. There's no reason to believe there's voter fraud. Anyone who's talking about voter fraud is trying to destabilize the election. We're not going to let them talk. And that would have worked under normal circumstances, except this beautiful idiocy. They sent everybody voter forms. And suddenly, all across America, people who believed the lie that there was no problem with voter fraud know someone or personally experienced getting a bunch of ballots mailed to their house for dead people, for people that don't live there anymore, for people that moved away, multiple registrations for minor differences in name spelling. Some people got, voter registrations were filled out in the name of their dogs because people had taken pet registry. It was insanity. And everybody saw it happening. How flawed those databases were was proven to hundreds of thousands of people across America. And now we have a election that comes to within the margin of error where voter fraud is a thing. So for the first time ever, we have widespread direct evidence in most Americans' lives that the databases we use to secure our vote are horribly broken. And now we have an election where everybody really cares about the possibility of voter fraud. And we live in a world of social media and cell phones where the videos taken through the windows of people destroying and manipulating ballots, all these tiny little stories that normally would have just been isolated issues, suddenly social media allows them all to come together. And we have a presidential candidate who, for the first time in Republican history, is willing to really go to the wall on voter fraud in the face of all the pressure from the media. And not only that, but amazingly, he's inspired Republicans to actually get behind this. We're seeing large groups of Republican voters going to polling places and volunteering to help with the recounts, which they've always been legally willing to do, but rarely bothered to do. You have to understand that in most battleground states, from top to bottom, the voting system is run by Democrats. The people at the polling place are generally Democrats, and then the people that are in charge of them are generally lifelong Democrats. And the person in charge of the voting as a whole is usually a Democrat in a battleground state. And the attorney general who's supposed to investigate fraud is also a Democrat, and the governor is a Democrat, and usually the mayor of the big city involved is a Democrat. So there's a Democrat chain of custody all the way along. So most of the fraud is by Democrats, just because they're the ones with the chance to do it. But suddenly we have this unique thing where everybody knows there's a problem. Suddenly it's impossible to deny. We have a candidate who's willing to fight about it and a voter base that's willing to actually show up and do something about it. The fiction that there's no problem with voter fraud in America and that our voting system no longer doesn't allow for fraud is dead. It's dead. CNN's going to try and hang on to it. The DNC is going to try and hang on to it. The social justice types are going to try and hang on to it because it's been so effective for them. But that conversation is now, that way to shut down that conversation is dead. We now know there's widespread voter fraud in America. We know that it has almost cost us a presidential election. We know that it came very close to costing us some Senate and congressional elections. And there's video and tens and hundreds of thousands of people across America who can look at their kitchen table and see a bunch of what would be fraudulent voter registration and absentee ballots there. They know that it's wrong. They've broken. It's proven. I think the Democrats made a mistake, as they have so many times in the Trump era, thinking that it was business as usual, and it's just not. And that may be Donald Trump, if he loses, last greatest gift to the Republicans and to the American process. Suddenly, we have to have the conversation about voter fraud that we should have been having all along. And that is really awesome, because whatever the outcome of this election, we need to do something about this. We're a technologically advanced country. I favor federal voter ID. I'm more than happy to pay for, like a census, like teams of people to go door to door and issue a free ID card, give them a camera, give them a biometric sensor, or let them do whatever they have to do, send translators, make sure that no one is denied access to this card because they're disabled, because they're poor, because they're homeless, because they don't speak the language, whatever. If you're over 18 and you're a citizen, I want you to get this card for free without barrier. And I'm all for the federal government investing whatever amount of money is required to make that happen. I don't want to disenfranchise anyone, but I'm tired of what we all know to be true, what we all joke about. It's been axiomatically true for 20, 40 years, my whole life, that, dead people vote Democrat, and we all kind of laugh, but it's true and it has to stop. Okay. I hope you guys are doing well. I've sort of been staying away from Facebook and some of the other social media where they're heavily censoring news about the election, and I'm paying a lot of attention to the places where there actually is information flowing. I'm sure once this is all resolved, you'll see me more commonly on social media, but I'm putting out these videos, and I hope you guys have a great day.